You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. Lebanon is a country which seems to be in permanent state of crisis. Since 2019 revolution against the governing elites, the country has witnessed economic and financial meltdown, the Beirut port blast caused by endemic corruption, and Israel's war on Gaza has all seen attacks on Lebanon by Israel. Lebanon by Israel. A politically fractured country which has in many respects never fully recovered from the 1975 to 1990 civil war. Indeed, many of the country's political formations that have governed, and some would say misgoverned, the Mediterranean country came out of this period. To gain a better understanding of the politics that shaped this Middle Eastern country, from Christian conservatism to Hezbollah, we are joined by Chloe Kattar. Dr. Chloe Kattar is an early career Leverhulme Fellow at the University of Oxford. Her project examines the links between Islamophobia and right-wing thought. Right-wing groups around the world have displayed strong anti-Islam sentiment in recent years, which have been mostly commented on by the press. She seeks to rethink this connection as a global rather than Western phenomenon, but offering the first historical account of the ways in which Islamophobia became a tenet of global conservatism in the past decades. A historian by formation, Dr. Kattar obtained her PhD from the University of Cambridge, where she examined right-wing intellectual circles and productions during the Lebanese Civil War. Excerpts of her work have been published in academic journals, such as the Historical Journal and Arab Studies Journal, and she has spoken about similar themes at multiple conferences in Beirut, Paris, Berlin, Amsterdam. She has previously lectured in the history of the Middle East at the Northumberland University. In her spare time, she writes analysis and personal opinions on Lebanon and the Middle East on her Instagram page, leb.historian. Welcome, Chloe, to MEMO Conversations.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here.
And it is our privilege and our joy to have you on. I would like to sort of go back to the beginning, as it were. What, drew you to want to study Lebanese history and politics? Specifically, you started off with the Lebanese Civil War in your research. What about that period did you want to research? Why were you drawn to it?
I think this is both a personal and a collective story, right? So I am myself a daughter of émigrés who flew, the Lebanese Civil War to relocate in France during that period. So during the Lebanese Civil War from the 70s, until broadly the 90s. And so I was born far away from, the homeland, and honestly grew up on horror stories, about Lebanon. My family was quite traumatized, they were from the South and they were traumatized about what was happening there. And so they imprinted on me a very pessimistic narrative on Lebanon. And, in typical, rebellious child syndrome, on the contrary, it only poked my curiosity, and I wanted to, know more about what was happening. And I think this is where it started. I think it's also to understand my own story. And this is where it all began, my parents meeting during the war and then fleeing the country. And this is why I chose to focus my PhD on that particular period. But on a more collective level, I'd say that we know very little about Lebanese history when we go to school. There's absolutely a structural problem there. So the Lebanese curriculum, when it comes to history education, doesn't include much beyond the creation of Greater Lebanon in 1920 or, the independence in 1943. And chances are, if you're enrolled in a French or American private school, then you know about world or Western history way more than Lebanese or Arab history if you grow up in Lebanon. So you actually finish school not equipped with critical understanding of your own country's past and, how all of this relate to current challenges. So to me, it made sense that, I saw a real need to contribute there at this level, to understand my own story and our collective story, technically. Yeah.
How did you find the process of actually doing that just on a personal level? I mean, you've obviously mentioned, how it was very important to you, but also in Lebanon itself, there's no real investigation into these issues. So, when you were doing all of this research, how did you find it personally and what surprised you?
So obviously it was all very interesting to me because I'm passionate about these things, but it wasn't an easy process at all. So first of all, if you're a historian in Lebanon, then the first challenge you are met with is the absence of a national archive center where you can actually go and check documents, official documentation, or any other sort of official or public sources. So the whole archival landscape is fragmented. You can go to private universities and check those sources, but it's quite hard to put a hand on those sources and documents that will help you conduct your research. So it was very much, being alone in a very chaotic place and trying to find archives, mapping those archives in private places, with the help of specific individuals, which is interesting, but not easy to do at all. People were quite helpful, which was a good thing. But I would say that working on such a, I would say, really difficult and painful period of Lebanese history, while going through another one that was taking place at the same moment, and I'm talking about all of these cumulative shocks that happened after 2019, it did take a toll on my mental health, because it makes you feel that not much is changing, and it's just a lot of crisis upon crisis. So it was also psychologically difficult. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. And also the other factor is that, as I mentioned in the intro, the governing elites of Lebanon are actually the same governing elites
Yeah.
that emanated out of the civil war. They were effectively the militias, and these factions went on to become political leaders. And a lot of the so-called reconstruction that we see in Beirut and Lebanon came from them as well, specifically. So after having such a devastating experience through war, you end up in a situation where the leaders of those wars who committed many of these atrocities are now the leaders again, even though, when we look at, and the system that was sort of agreed upon at Taif at the end of the civil war
Yeah.
was supposed to lead to a transition away
Yeah.
from the system that Lebanon currently has, which was
Yeah.
seen as more of a way of just getting a ceasefire, just
Yeah.
ending the fighting,
Yeah.
and then a transition away from sectarianization, which didn't happen at all.
Never took place. Yeah. Yeah.
And so there's a kind of, and this inability to move away from that kind of system has produced a system that is constantly going through crisis.
Definitely. Going through those same archives, those same news, reading the same names, all over again, the same families, actually, those same sectarian chiefs, as you say, some of them born out of the war, but some of them, existed before the war, like the Jmayils or the Jumblat, and then going back to today and seeing those same families and those same, main actors dominating the scene. Obviously, it just makes you realize that between the pre and the post war eras, there's not much change that's happened. And you feel that we've taken a lot from the war era into the post-war era. A lot of those legacies are still with us. And as you said, the Taif Agreement and all of those other agreements that ended the war, ended the fighting, ended the open military confrontation. But a lot of the confrontation or the tensions that existed on another level, or very much with us still. Absolutely, yeah.
Indeed. And one area of your research, which you focused quite a bit on, is this idea of Christian conservatism. So I sort of now want to bring this into the conversation. When we talk about Christian conservatism, what do we mean? And what does it mean within the context of Lebanon? What does it look like? And, what role did the Lebanese civil war play both before, during, and after?
So obviously, Christian conservatism in the Lebanese context can be defined in many ways, depending on the epoch, right, that we're looking at. But it can be safe to assume today that it mostly equates identity politics, right? So it advocates for the perceived privileged rights of Lebanese Christian within the specific political system that Lebanon has. And obviously, this varies from moderate to very radical embodiment of this ideology. But all of this obviously changes with time. So if we examine the pre-war era, right, it is really hard to talk about conservative Christian politics in Lebanon without looking at the biggest political party that existed there, and that many consider actually to be the first mass party in Lebanon, which is known in Arabic as the Kata'ib, but in English as the Lebanese phalanges, right? And during the 50s, so we know that it is inspired by a fascist tendency, right, that emanated in the 30s. But during the 50s, this party, because it has longevity over time, changes, right? And it becomes quite progressive, or at least it adopts quite progressive aspects in the 50s. It advocates anti-sectarianism, state reform, labor and social security laws, and all of that. And obviously, even though it has a membership open to all Lebanese, its main recruiting and voting base is Christian. Now, with time, and especially once the Palestinian Liberation Organization becomes a rising force within the Lebanese political landscape, those same Christian circles who did not look so conservative per se back then start adopting a way more direct sectarian language and positions. So in the years leading to the Civil War, which started, technically in 1975, but confrontation was already happening prior. There were to me two main axes, or two main points on which the different parties were fighting. There was obviously the question of Palestinian resistance from Lebanese soil, which in the eye of Christian conservatives opposed or negated Lebanese sovereignty, right? But there was also the question of the regime, the nature of the Lebanese regime, right? Its system. And the Socialist Party back then was advocating openly for a reform of this regime, meaning that they were calling for the abolition of sectarian representation and more equality between Muslim and Christians within the representation apparatus of the Lebanese state. To these demands, to these clear demands of changing the regime, the Kata'ib and other Christian groups said no, and they took up arms to refuse that. So technically, they were preserving the regime. And if being conservative is, first of all, a resistance to change, then this is when they become ultra-conservative in that moment in particular. It doesn't mean that they did not abide all along by Christian supremacy, right, within the Lebanese state. But the period of the war sees a clear radicalization of that position. And I would say even innovation, because they start thinking of new concepts like federalism or even separatism, right, which was not common currency before the war. So this is what my research was, my PhD is, to see how this period is fundamental to make the Christian conservative movement in Lebanon even more radical during that period. So today, obviously, there's in the post-war area, there are other Christian groups than the Kata'ib. You have the Lebanese forces, the Free Patriotic Movement, and they all have taken some of this legacy with them, right? They all advocate for decentralization, some sort of federalism. They hyper-focus on sovereignty, which is why they're very opposed to Hezbollah, especially the Lebanese forces. They all show xenophobia or racism against refugee. And they mostly work to preserve those Christian prerogatives within the state, right? So the presidency of the republic, the leadership of the army, etc., etc. So it's still preserved in some way. But I would like to say that overall, I would say that today, those Christian conservatives, especially in the political elite, they're not that different from other non-Christian accomplices in the regime, right? So we need to look at them as a network of sectarian chiefs that work together more than, against each other. And the other main point that I want to say is that it would be misleading to conflate all Christians in Lebanon with those Christian conservative parties or movements. There's a very long tradition of Christian intellectuals and activists being at the forefront of progressive politics in Lebanon. And it's important to say that. And especially today, a lot of Christian voters are moving away from these politics. So I think it's just important to put a bit of nuance there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's always an important context when we talk about Lebanon, that just because you belong to a certain sect doesn't mean you're going to vote politically or in favor of politically. I mean, you can find across all the sects, you can find even people who are, let's say, Lebanese Shia, who are, even people who are very conservative and devout in their personal lives, doesn't necessarily equate to support for Hezbollah or anything. So
not at all. I think here is important to make a difference between social conservative and political conservatism, which is another of course layer of that. As you said, you can be quite religious and socially conservative and not be an adept of those sectarian politics. Absolutely.
Yes, indeed. And I mean, but I want to sort of drill into some of the stuff you're saying to sort of break this up a little bit, because there's a lot of very interesting trends you've identified. So, I mean, the interesting thing here, I think I want to start with is when we seem, from what I'm picking up from you here as well, when we talk about Christian conservatism in Lebanon, or in the context of these political conservatisms, it feels like a general conservatism in the sense that we want to preserve our group privilege. It is not, for example, let's say, similar to when Americans talk about Christian conservatism, where they talk about specifically religiously aligned movements that have certain biblical beliefs that they want to see translated into policy. We don't seem to see that in this context.
Well, I think this is a very important question that I've grappled myself, because when you use a term like conservatism, which is, a very loaded concept, and as you can, it means something in the Lebanese context, but it means something else, as you've, pointed out now, in the American context. So it means different things depending on the social and political setting, you're looking at. And in general, because it's an umbrella term, historians and, academics, they always emphasize the particularity of the group or the variant they're working on. But I do, and I say, that Christian conservatives in Lebanon obviously stand for a very specific concept that can only be explained through Lebanese history, which is different from another history. But I do believe that conservatives share common traits in general, right? So they're attached to tradition. They would tend to reject abrupt change, right? They prefer liberty over equality, which is the case of the American and the Lebanese conservatives, for instance. They are an adept of limiting the intervention of state. So they would be more towards the rights of groups rather than the rights of the power of the state. They're very patriotic, etc., etc. So we find that in some capacity in the Lebanese case. So Christian conservatives are very attached to the prerogatives of their own sect, and they try to limit the intervention of a possible secular state in that area as well. But I would say that in Lebanon, it's easier to conflate social and political conservatism. So in the case of American conservatism, as you say, you can be economically conservative, so be very much for neoliberal, deregulation of the market, again, against state intervention, against taxes, but you can be also socially not conservative or be socially conservative. I think in the case of Lebanon, all of those sectarian movement or very conservative movement, might align as well with social conservative, because you would find a preference, for instance, for same-sex marriage, or you would find still a prevalence of patriarchal mentalities and attitudes, right? The more you are prone to these sectarian, I would say, representation, or the more you're prone to being very attached to your group, you might develop those social conservative aspects as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting as you were saying that. I was thinking because there was actually, I remember reading, I read it once and I've been trying to find it ever since, a survey that was done on, this was in the case of America, on American conservatism. And it was looking at the question of Christianity on conservatism. And it was looking at the differences between secular conservatives in America
Yeah.
and religious conservatives in America. And the surprising finding there was that religious conservatives were actually less conservative than the secular conservatives,
Yeah.
because for religious conservatives, they do have a sense that they tend to be very conservative on certain specific issues. And so this is the evangelical right and so on. So LGBT rights, they're very conservative on. Abortion, that's a big one. I don't think it looked at Israel, but I think Israel would be another one, support for Israel.
Yeah.
But on most other issues, they're to the left of
Yeah.
of the secular conservatives, so they tend to think immigration is a good thing,
Okay.
because it's the idea that we're all God's children, so we have to extend our mercy, and on various other issues. And so they sort of said, well, in this context of American conservatism, Christianity is the moderating force on conservatism.
Yeah.
But that's obviously another way of sort of thinking about the sort of complexity of the term conservatism in that context. But in the Lebanese case, as we're saying, it has its own history, and obviously group identity, and it's evolved over time. But as you sort of also pointed out quite a few times, it's still tied to the global context. I mean, your opener about the Phalange, Qatar forces originally taking its inspiration from fascism, that implies a very strong global connection. So if we could sort of start there, what was it from fascism in the beginning that they sort of sought to, emulate in Lebanon, as it were?
So back in the 30s, the leaders of the Kataib movement were very much inspired by the apparatus of fascist organization, right? The organization itself, the discipline. I think it was at that moment Pierre Jumeil who established the Kataib and who went to went to Germany and attended the Olympics there, and probably was especially very inspired by the athleticism, right? The athletic aspect of those very young male bodies who represented, the main machinery of those fascist organization, right? And so this was before it was technically known as Nazis as we know it today, is very much this attraction to organization, discipline, physical attributes, male, patriarchal or male, I would say, values. That this is very much where it starts. And this is what then happens when he comes back to Lebanon. There's a sense that this is a very organized discipline, the first mass party in Lebanon, and very much also invested in bringing those two aspects together, right? The sports aspect. I think Pierre Jumeil was an avid sports player, or he was interested in that, but at the same time politics as well. Yeah. So the nation, building the nation. Yeah.
So it's interesting because to me it sounds like he's impressed by the aesthetic appeal that he's seeing everywhere, the bodies, the sense of discipline, what you can observe from the outside, the aesthetic appeal. But it also, I mean, from what I'm picking up from that, doesn't feel like he's deeply invested in Nazi ideas itself, because fascism, there's obviously a distinction here between fascism and Nazism, and one of the distinctions is that Nazism is fundamentally, as an ideology, views things through a biological and ecological, and it's an environmental movement in a funny kind of way, in that they believe that there are races and there are environments, and there can only be one race dominant over every environment. But it's fundamentally a biological reading of politics, whereas fascism tends to be much more on the cultural side. And a lot of the time they go out of the frame of science. They
Yeah.
will talk about,
Yeah.
pre Reformation politics as
Mhm.
being the aesthetic ideal, you find. And it feels like in the Lebanese case, in the case of Jumael, he seems to be going with the more fascist aspect of it rather than the Nazi aspect.
Yes, so this is why we say that it is fascist inspired at the beginning, right? And I think there's a very short study that tackled this question. Was the Kata'ib actually a fascist organization in the 30s? And did it join this global movement across the world, And the study concludes that actually it lacks some of the particular elements to make it a full fascist movement, but it is inspired by that. That's one. And then obviously because, because of the realities of the of the Lebanese system, then the Kata'ib has really to adapt to events on the ground. And then it needs to be a bit more open beyond its Christian, direct voting basis. And so it evolves. But to come back to this idea of biological reading of politics, this is something that actually appears during the Lebanese Civil War, perhaps not in Kata'ib circles, but among a bit more right-wing circles that start give a reading of Lebanese sects as ethnic groups that are not anymore, the same people, but with just different religious views, which has been, the myth, the foundational national myth of Lebanon, right? We're all the same, but we just, a harmony of religious groups. They start seeing this differently. So we become ethnic groups with actual different psychologies, even different blood groups, right? We belong to different races technically, and I've written about this in my latest publication. And this emerges in a time of crisis, right? In a time of confrontation and existential struggle. At least this is when they see it as such. Yeah.
Yeah, so it feels to me as if, because there is an idea they could call upon if they were trying to talk about different races within Lebanon. I mean, it's the Phoenician identity, right?
Yeah.
How the idea that the Maronite Christians specifically are the descendants of the Phoenician, and there's even like things named after Phoenician stuff across Lebanon. You even have a hotel, the Phoenicia. So it's a very popular idea. But then you had people like Kamal Salabi who did his famous book, and then where he basically just says, we're clearly not descendants of Phoenicians. Our history goes back to Yemen. He goes, the only group that might have some claim to Phoenician would be the Sunni Muslims, but even there it's mixed.
Definitely. I think this is it has a way longer history. So the Phoenician ideal starts, even before the 1920, but in the 1920, it really takes currency among those same Christian circles. But yeah, it has a very long history, and it has, still today, it has a powerful attraction to many people in Lebanon. I think there have been DNA studies to prove some sort of continuity in terms of genomes. I'm not really sure, but yeah, it's a whole debate, and it's one element of the discourse, right? Yeah.
But I'm also wondering here, because you've also mentioned, as we were, when we were talking about elements of obviously initially we're talking about the Khatib, the Phalange, which was that they start to develop a more sectarian identity in relation to the fact that you've got Palestinian organizations in Lebanon, and obviously the Palestinian refugees that came out of 1948, and many Palestinians were a very big part of Lebanese society. You also have a corporate element where the Palestinians who are quite wealthy ran banks, were effectively run out of the banking industry in the 1960s, which one historian I read said, and this is the banking crisis that began Lebanon, its trajectory, which 10 years later would lead to civil war, but that's another debate. But there is another aspect to this, which is obviously Israel itself, right? So there have been, studies done on Israel's interest in Lebanon. So there was a book called, I think, Lebanon in the Early Zionist Imagination, which goes up until 1970s, I think. I want to say, which is where they envisage Lebanon as a kind of potential ally if it can become a fully Christian state. And so they sort of saw it as, in a funny kind of way, a kindred spirit, but, obviously a lessered spirit in a sense, because there's a supremacism within Zionism as well. And also civil war is the best example of this, where you had an alliance effectively between the Khatib and Israel's invasion of Lebanon. And it was really interesting. Once I was reading one report about Ariel Sharon, because Ariel Sharon was the defense minister in 1982 in Israel, and he was the one blamed for the invasion in 82, and because it didn't go well for Israel reputationally, he was effectively chased out of government because of it. But there was his extract I was reading where he was talking about he was talking to his wife about what it was like to go to Lebanon, because before the invasion of Lebanon, he actually went to Lebanon secretly to meet with Jumayel, the one that was Pere Jumayel, was it, the one who was murdered?
Bashir
Jamal, sorry. And he was then asked by his wife, so what did you think of the Lebanese? And he goes, they would kiss your hand, they would take your woman's hand, kiss it with one hand while holding a knife behind the other. And that was his sort of impression. And that sort of, in my view, that sort of summarizes a lot of the Israeli views I've seen of Lebanon's Christians, that they're potential, they're not people we can fully trust, but they are like us. But as away from that sort of tangent, what was the relationship like between the two and how they viewed each other, particularly in the Lebanese context?
Right. So as you said, the book you mentioned traces back this, as you say, a bit like complex relationship between, not Jews and Christians per se, but Zionists and Maronites, since, those early years, when the state of Lebanon is established, there are contacts. There are meetings that happen before the establishment of Israel. But I think once 1948 happened, there's obviously a severance of those direct relationships. And the war effectively is the moment where they can resume again. They can start again because of the support that Israel gave to specific Maronite militias in terms of weaponry, mostly weapons, and strategic assistance. And so within the archives I've looked at, as you say, there is some sort of existential dilemma that happens in those right-wing Christian circles, right? We need Israel to be able to fight off those other threats that they perceive, Islam, Palestinians, John Blott's forces, and even, broader Arab aggression. But at the same time, they're not to be trusted because, of many reasons, of being stronger than us, being used by them, etc., etc. But there is a fascination, obviously. There is a fascination at that moment. There is, because of the borders, because for once, the southern border, so at the southern border of Lebanon, the northern border of Israel, there are a movement of people happening again during the war. And we know that a lot of Lebanese from these circles visit Israel, and they have a lot to say about Israeli scientists or Israeli intellectuals. And there is some sort of, exchange that happens, even in terms of, ideas and possible, cooperation. And from the Lebanese side, perhaps a bit of emulation on their ability to establish a state an ethno-nationalist state, I guess. There is some sort of emulation of that, but as you say, a lot of mistrust and fear as well of what this could bring on the long run. Yeah.
Indeed. But this is obviously, a relationship that doesn't really go the way that people, they initially imagined, because of course, Israel didn't get the ally in Lebanon that it wanted.
No.
And even now, I don't get the impression that this is a popular talking point within right-wing Christian circles, that have these connections to Israel. We had them in the past. There is a small community of Lebanese Christians who now live in Israel, who went after the withdrawal of Israeli forces in 2000, and some of their children are actually serving in the IDF now. So there is a circular connection there too. But thinking about it today, as I was sort of alluded to, what is the impression of the cooperation between the two in Christian circles and non-Christian circles from this period?
I think it's a very taboo subject, obviously, because we're at war with Israel. So any sort of, link or interaction or anything of the sort is automatically seen as, rightly so, as treason. So there's very much a use of this past, especially, Christian past, by other political opponent to say that you have a traitor past, right? You've collaborated with the enemy. There's very much this discourse, but because it's taboo, because it's also in the past, and we know that everything from the war has been erased from collective memory, right? We don't talk about these things. The amnesty law meant that, we just bury those things like it never happened. So it doesn't appear, it doesn't emerge, a lot. It emerged in times of crisis, when you want to use that past against your opponent. But today, very much within Lebanon, and I would say even within those right-wing Christian circles, there's no real, I would say, aspiration to establish any sort of contact like before. I think because, history has given some lessons, but there's definitely on the part of those groups an opposition to going to war against Israel, right? An opposition to Hezbollah's tactics and wanting, to isolate Lebanon from those regional politics and, isolationism technically. Because the war happened and because some lessons were, taken from, I wouldn't be surprised that some would still talk about a possible peace process in the future. But so far, the hard stance is rejection of Hezbollah's war on Israel. Yeah.
Yes, and also maybe more at the social level, a kind of still a distrust of Palestinians.
Yes, definitely. Definitely, because again, of the loaded, war legacy and war history. And I encountered this in my own circle, especially with the older generation who have, been traumatized by those events. And this trauma exists on both sides of the war. And in the absence of justice, and of true reconciliation, then those wounds are still very much alive and the distrust is still there because there's been no active, justice process or transitional justice, anything of the sort. So there is a distrust that, a Palestinian militias could emerge again in Lebanon. And so there's this phobia of these things happening. But we know very much today that this is not the case and that it's Hezbollah, actually, a Lebanese actor, who has weapons beyond, Lebanese legitimacy that calls the shots. It's not those Palestinian, groups. So things have changed, but the fear is still there. Yeah.
Yes. And I also want to sort of, because there's another element which, you're now looking into, which goes beyond Lebanon, of course, but it's the element of Islamophobia itself. So talk to me about the, Islamophobia, first of all, in the sort of Lebanese context, how it exists, how it manifests, and also how it interacts with Islamophobia, as far as you can tell, internationally.
So for the period I've looked at, which is the Lebanese Civil War, there is, of course, an increase of Islamophobic thought or judgment, in a sense that Muslims as a whole are perceived as a community, the Ummah, that doesn't leave place to minorities, right? And so there is inherently in Islam, an inability to look at the other on an equal level. So that's the main argument that Lebanese right-wing intellectuals level at that point, right? Because of how the Sharia is, because of how, you know, Muslims are first of all understood as ummah, so beyond nationalities and beyond ethnic or racial lines, it's first of all the religion that brings them together. And so they use at that particular moment a specific element of history, which is the existence of dhimmis, right, in previous centuries, which is this you know, a very specific position given in society, given to Jews and Christians under Islamic rule, which is a sort of they argue it's a second citizen position, right? They are protected and they are allowed to practice their religion, but they have restriction on what they can do and they have to pay taxes. So they use this historical example and apply it to their situation today. And this is very much the discourse that Bashir Jumayil and his circle use at Baghdad. We are threatened by dhimmitude, right? Again today, because Lebanon is a haven for Christian, and you know it's being under attack. So my research today is to look at how this specific argument, right, about these essentialist discourse on Islam that come from those minorities in the Middle East, those, I mean, not all of them, but those who think that way, right, have migrated to the West and are now actually inspiring similar Islamophobic discourse in the West, right? So we know that dhimmitude, the concept, today means that in the West, there's a tendency of, you know, because of immigration, and because of, you know, democracy, etc., there's a tendency of Western culture to erode. I mean, that's the conspiracy theory, and to be replaced progressively over generational renewal by Muslim or Islam or Muslim culture. And so it's the mentality of dhimmitude, which, I mean, has absolutely no historical precedent in the West, being applied to the West. And that's a bit those discourse that I'm trying to look at, because now they exist in French right-wing circles, they exist as well in American right-wing circles, and you can see those concepts, which have absolutely nothing to do with, you know, Western history, being applied to contemporary, you know, debates about Islam in Europe or in the United States.
That's quite interesting, actually, because I was wondering how that would work, because, you know, because I can think, you know, there's a lot of Islamophobia in the West, which feels like it's going east as well. I mean, and it's not just, you know, within Lebanese Christian circles. I mean, one of the most bizarre things is you will see, you know, country like Egypt, for example, in 2013, people who are Muslim repeating Islamophobic talking points because it was anti-brotherhood. And all the conspiracy theories that sort of came out of it, you know, the idea that Obama's a secret Muslim Brotherhood supporter and all that sort of weird stuff that sort of there's a weird like afterlife within the Arab world of Islamophobia that sort of emanates from the West. But it's interesting to see it's also coming out of the Arab world as well into the West in terms of sort of dhimmitude, as you're saying. But there's also, you know, because I remember, you know, and I also feel that there's also in the West, in the Western context as well, a lack of understanding about the roles they've played in the sectarianization of the Middle East. I mean, it's very poorly understood, despite, you know, I think in the 19th century, France declared itself the protector of Christians in the Ottoman Empire. The British had to scramble and find them. This is the part that always makes it up. The British had to scramble to find a minority. I think they became the Druze's protectorate at one point. It was because all the others were taken up, so they were looking for one to champion. So there's this weird colonial history here that, you know, people don't really remember anymore. So it's a really interesting area in that respect, and it sort of connects you to right-wing movements abroad, which I think is one of your interests, is this thing. So, but I was also thinking about something you said, which is that the perception in Lebanese Christian circles is that the Muslims are not loyal to the national project. They can never be, because they belong to this Umayyatic model, where they see themselves as, they want to obviously
Yeah.
subjugate us, but they belong to a much greater whole.
Yeah.
And so they are, in a sense, a kind of rootless community.
Yeah.
And there's a parallel there, I think, with anti-Semitism in Europe, in the sense that the Jewish person in the European context and anti-Semitic context is seen as not loyal to the national project. They're loyal to their own kind, as it were. These are the anti-Semitic tropes, and so there's an overlap here in a way.
Mm. Definitely, definitely. I think a lot of these way of thinkings is, I mean, at the core is a process of othering, right? It's a process of looking at another and using fears, right? Fears that are inner to your own perception or specific to your own views of the world, and then projecting that fear onto another, right? And then using and then misusing, historical event, past conflict, past generational trauma to build a case against that other, and then, make it a cultural, reality, as so far as, you use everything in your power to exclude the other, right? So I think I think that's a great parallel that you're making, anti-Semitism, anti-Islamophobia. I think they're quite tied, and you cannot understand another. If you're understanding one and not the other, then there's absolutely a bias there. And so I think there's a lot to do on this concept of othering, right? Why? How to come, especially in today's society, because you can do that in so many ways, right? Against, racism is a part of it, refugees, no matter when they come from, or being othered as well. I think at the core, there needs to be a discussion on that first and foremost, because it's not only about religion. In the case of Lebanon, I barely use, as you say, religious argument, because it's not. Sectarianism is an othering, right? It's not about religious or faith. Yeah.
And I wonder now, 'cause in terms of Lebanon today, what impact do we still see from this Christian conservatism as well as non-Christian conservatism and the politics of Lebanon?
So, to me today, again, we discussed this. We said that conservatism can be explained in so many ways in different contexts, right? But if you strip away all of those layers and understand conservatism as a force that opposes progress, right? It is very much attached to arcane, traditional embodiments of institution, then Christian or non-Christian conservative movements or politics in Lebanon are simply blocking the change process. And in today's Lebanon, which is, I'm talking about the post-2019 era, which has seen a series of cumulative shock, right? The collapse of the banking sector, the devaluation of the Lebanese lira, the Beirut explosion was demolished a quarter, I'm not sure as much as of the capital of the country, the erosion of the social economic fabric of the country, the poverty, the soaring prices. Those conservative forces are conservative in the sense that there's absolutely no will to find solution to that, and perhaps no expertise to find, actually, to do the right thing, to implement change, and to, open the door to progressive new political forces, to allow generational renewal in the political realm to happen, and Hezbollah and the Kataib, or any traditional, now we call them traditional parties, but those who are linked somehow to the Lebanese civil war are guarding the regime. They have absolutely no reason to let go of it, because this is how they survive. It's a network of clientelist parties that offer social provision to their own sects, because there's no state to do that. And in that sense, they're all allies together. And without that sectarian entity, without that sectarian system, which is at the core of conservative politics in Lebanon, they would not survive.
So I now want to sort of bring us to Hezbollah, because obviously they're when you're talking about regime guarding and socially conservative forces, Hezbollah is now probably the premier one right now.
Yeah.
So in what way do we see these features that we've just discussed in sort of Christian conservatism do we find in Hezbollah, and where do they sort of differ?
So, I mean, a lot of people agree that Hezbollah, or not agree, or perceive Hezbollah as a conservative force, right? But other people disagree. And I think to answer that question, you would need to define a bit what sort of political ideology or what Hezbollah stands for, right? And again, then there's a lot of way to explain that, because Hezbollah first and foremost exists to resist Israel. That was its mission, its raison d'être. And after 2000, it achieved its role. And then the whole dilemma was how to exist, beyond just resisting Israel into further attacks. But it's usually defined as, Shiite radicalism, because, radicalism in the sense that they're trying to change or transform a society. And at the beginning, this was through the theory of wilayat al-faqih, which is very much inspired by Khomeini's writing. And then, which is technically theocratic aspiration, which could be very, very much seen as a conservative or right-wing outlook on society. But then again, they more and more abandon that ideal, and some people, define Hezbollah as actually left-wing because it's anti-imperialist, because it's very much on, focused on social provision, but then again only for its own basis. So I think Hezbollah is quite hard to define, probably has an element of both right wing and left wing. And then again, what does all of these mean in Lebanon, right? They don't really apply very directly, because sectarian interest, come on top of all of this and makes it hard to define it. But again, if we go back to the initial question about how conservative politics, are in Lebanon today, as you say, Hezbollah is at the vanguard of protecting the regime as it is. And we know that, especially since 2016, since Michel Aoun was elected as the president of Lebanon, Hezbollah has been, if not the main, one of the most important driving force of this regime, right? It's in all of the state institution. It has vested interest in the Lebanese state. And we've seen during those 2019 nationwide protests how Hezbollah and its allies, the Amal movement, have been really at the forefront of repressing those protests, which were about, demanding change, demanding more justice, demanding more reform, which is really contradictory to its own declaration, right? The one that it published in the 80s, which was, a call for all of those downtrodden, all of those people who were, still living under unjust conditions, a call to revolution, a call to, justice. All of this is completely antithetical to why it was born. We can see this as well in its direct intervention in the probe of the Beirut blast, right? The investigation that we've tried to lead in Lebanon to understand what happened during the Beirut explosion. And we know that Hezbollah has been working against the appointed judge. So there's absolutely gatekeeping on behalf of Hezbollah in terms of maintaining old regime rules, maintaining the sectarian regime as it is. And absolutely, it's a part of the conservative landscape as much as Christian or non-other Christian conservative movement. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's also kind of interesting here because, as you sort of correctly point out, Hezbollah, because in many ways it's a party that shifts with the tide like all the other parties.
Yeah.
It's in a way you can ask the question, how useful is it to study the ideology of these groups, because they seem to evolve in any case when the wind changes. I think with Hezbollah case, it's kind of interesting because they were coming off the bat when they were formed in, I think, 1982, of what was effectively, you had a kind of sort of socialist communism that existed among particularly the Shia communities, because the communist parties, where a lot of them went. And so they pick up a lot of the ideas from there. And there's also a phenomenon of left-wing Islamism, which no one
Yeah.
talks about anymore. It's partly because largely it's gone, but there was a form of that in the 70s.
Yeah.
But yeah, and so I think, an interesting question here then would be, to what extent was thinking about it through the prism of ideology a useful thing to do?
Especially in the case of Hezbollah, as you say, it's defined as an Islamist party. But then if we understand Islamism, usually it means, its objective is to Islamize society, or, establish an Islamist sort of rule, any sort of rule. And then even though this is an objective stated in the 80s, Hezbollah has abandoned this and has not, mentioned this anymore in the past decades. And it's actually never attempted such a thing in Lebanon. So, I mean, Hezbollah, I would say, is mostly so far, its main ideology would be the resistance, right? Or its main, even today, right? It would be mostly a militant Islam in the sense that it's aimed at defeating Israel. I think that would be the strongest ideological point it has over the years and the years, because from the inside it absolutely lacks I would say a proper program or a proper vision for what it can offer to Lebanon. Right, so I would say it's a militant Islamist group, because it is one of its mostly well-defined objective has been, fighting Israel. Yeah.
And so sort of my last question, I might break this down a little bit, which is to do with you as a historian and your role in society. So, at a time like we're living in now, and unfortunately Lebanon is always in crisis, so there's no specific time in that sense. But what do you think is the responsibility of someone who is historically aware or is a historian in a time like this? And sort of connected to that, how do you feel Lebanese society values historians? Because I'm thinking as well, I mean, as you've said, hard to access archive and that kind of thing. So there's a sense at the official level, there's no real wanting or need for historians. But also thinking about your Instagram account, the Leb Historian, you seem to get a lot of interaction from younger people, I assume, because of Instagram. So I'm sort of wondering, how do they value the history, and what sort of differences do you see among them? How do you think they, think about all of this stuff?
Yeah, so I think there is, I mean, there is a role for the historian, especially in crisis, because somehow historians explain, or at least attempt to explain, change, right? So I think this applies to, Lebanon and beyond Lebanon. It's not only a Lebanese thing. And we can see today we're at, a period of worldwide change and upheaval and, climate change, Palestine, genocide. So when all of these things happen, when really crises happen, historians are called upon to explain, why this is happening now and how this contrasts with the period preceding it, or is it a continuity or a change, right? So I think this is how I explain or understand why historians are called upon to say something when, crisis knocks at the door. I think in Lebanon's case, especially, as we've discussed this so far, we are in a period of major crisis, especially in the past few years. So there's just too much to handle. There's the collapse of the whole society and state at the moment, right? And so people have major question on, how come we've arrived to that state? Because now it touches their daily lives, right? It's not only corruption at the higher stratas of state. There's no electricity, there's soaring inflation, money is gone from the bank accounts, it's just everywhere. There's no escaping what has happened in the past decade. So people have questions now, and they want to know whose fault is that, what we could have done to change things. And I think the role of historians, especially public historians, the ones who are willing to bring this historical content to the public discussion and make it relevant to actual challenges, is appreciated in the Lebanese context. Because as we said, there's no official curriculum. There's no widely available resource for people to read about this. If you're a layman and you have a 9-to-5 job and don't have the time to read books, to conduct your own research, it's so hard getting an overall picture of such a complex crisis. So I think there's been an appreciation and an appetite for, the surge of podcasts, of social media pages, of, just discussions on topics, right? And we say I post stuff on Instagram, and Instagram is very much something of the new generation. And I think the appetite or the interaction I get on my page, I explain it because of what happened in 2019. I can see I was posting before 2019, and I had very limited interaction because in 2019 happened, and the whole collapse happened in a matter of few months. My generation, which had been disillusioned with politics for a very long time, had at the moment to, just, take action and start asking questions. And in that moment, they started being less aloof to politics, more interested in politics. And this came hand in hand with an interest in the past, because to understand how we got to that point, people knew that there must be answers in the past, right? And I guess a public historian or historians is still going to be your most objective source, at least the least biased source, especially when you live in a country where the media landscape is so biased, is so sectarian. So this is how I explain it, really. Yeah, it's a really a combination of facts that make historian more important in the public, in a country like Lebanon now. Yeah.
And where do you see for yourself personally, as someone who's doing this content, where do you think it's going to go in the future?
I'm not sure, honestly. I just think that it's a lot of work to do. A lot of it is free, so it's sometimes it's overwhelming. I think it's very encouraging. I think there might be more demand for that, but I think at some point this demand needs to be materialized at an official level, right? So as long as there's no curriculum, there's so little that 1 or 2 or 3 individuals can do in the public sphere. This knowledge needs to be democratized. It needs to be vulgarized. And there needs at some point to be in Lebanon, and I know this again is linked to sectarian politics, a new council, a new committee to look at the curriculum again, at history education again. And the appetite for history now that we're seeing might perhaps at some point push for that agenda. But I will very much continue to do what I do. I'm just also very aware and realistic about what one person can do, or a handful of people can do. It's still limited, yeah.
Chloe Kattar, thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversation.
Thank you for having me. This was a very stimulating conversation. I'm very happy to have been a part of it.
Our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you'd like to catch this one or previous MEMO Conversations, please do go to our website, but please do tune in next time for more MEMO Conversation.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.